Hello, my name is GiBi, this is Toto, and welcome to GiBi's Horror Homestead. This is a video in the ongoing series I'm making about the Five Nights at Freddy's Fazbear Frights novels. In each video, I'm going to summarize, analyze, and theorize about one of the stories in the ongoing Fazbear Frights anthology series. We're now looking at the sixth book in the series, Blackbird, which has, in my opinion, the absolute worst cover so far. I'm currently a believer in the Frights fiction fan theory, which states that all these books are in-universe novels published by Fazbear Entertainment to hide the crimes of their past. So now we're going to look at the first story in the physical book Blackbird, also called Blackbird. This story, like Bunny Call, is actually based on one of Scott Cawthon's own personal experiences. While Bunny Call is loosely based on a prank that Scott almost pulled on his family, and then his regret afterwards, Blackbird is based on Scott's sleep paralysis demon. My best understanding is that when you're asleep, when you're dreaming and you're in REM sleep, your body has to put you into paralysis so you don't act out your dreams. But it's possible to enter into this state when you're technically awake. Basically, if you sit totally still, don't move a muscle besides breathing, for roughly half an hour, your body's going to enter you into sleep paralysis. In this state, you're kind of like half dreaming, but also awake. It's not a lucid dream. You're not awake in a dream. You're where you are, awake, and then dream stuff happens around you. A lot of the time, this happens when people are sick, or they're trying to go to sleep and they're tired, or they wake up in the middle of the night and trying to go back to sleep, and then they get paralyzed, and they don't know what's happening. And when you're in this state, whatever you think starts to happen around you. And typically, if it's night and you're scared and you feel paralyzed, what you're going to see is scary things. The shadow in the corner is going to become a shadow man who comes to get you. Because you're paralyzed, people will also report feeling like there's someone sitting on top of them, whether in like a scary way it's a demon holding you down, or as people have stated before, they're getting real friendly with demons. Ghosts. If you're ever in this scenario and you want to get out of it, just start by like shaking your head and wiggling your fingers and your toes, and eventually once you start moving, you'll break out of this mode where you're dreaming while awake, and then you'll be perfectly fine. This happens to a lot of people who don't know what it is, and so it's actually terrifying. Sleep paralysis is one of my scariest childhood memories because I didn't know what was happening, and when I tried to explain it to my parents, they're like, "You were dreaming." And I'm like, "No, I absolutely was not. I was awake. The demon person was coming after me." Anyway, Scott's sleep paralysis vision was of this giant blackbird that appeared in his room when he was taking a nap on vacation. And so that's why he wrote this story. Because this story is based on a dream that Scott had, there's a huge portion where the main character is trying to sleep, and then the bird comes after him, and so we get treated to like dream nightmare sequences, which is not great. I'm pretty sure that's the part that Scott wanted to write, and then Andrea Wagner, the author of the story, was forced to fit it into the book that she was actually writing. The story she was really trying to tell, which is actually pretty good. So now we're going to summarize Blackbird. Noel and Sam are sophomores in college and are in a film class together. They're making a horror movie. The opening line of the story is, "It needs to be bloody." Horror's not in the blood, it's in the creep factor. The rest of the story will be commentary on these two lines. One character says it needs to be bloody, that's Noel, to be a good story. The other character, that's Sam, says no it doesn't, horror isn't all about blood. We then proceed to get a mostly bloodless horror story so that the character who says you don't need a lot of blood ends up being right, except the problem is that that's implying that you think the story is scary, which I personally do not. Sitting in film class, they're trying to come up with a concept for their horror movie. Sam, who is described as a nerd on the first page, overhears other groups talking about their concepts. Serial killer, zombie, vampire, demon, 4 words that can describe William Afton. Sam's partner Noel is less of a nerd. Noel keeps getting distracted by the girls in the classroom. I'm going to talk about this more in the analysis section, but this story is definitely aimed at a higher age than all the previous stories in the series. I've talked before about how if a story wants to note that a female character is attractive, it'll say that she's wearing like a tight sweater, or she's wearing the color red, because red stands for lust. It's a shorthand for not wanting to overtly sexualize a character in these stories. But Blackbird just goes straight for the throat. "You have to admit she has a fine caboose," Noel said. Obviously caboose is a silly word. It's not being like crass or using foul language, but it's still the fact that this character is being characterized by looking at a girl's butt. He is a sexual being, which is like the first time we've seen that in a Fright story. The girl that he's talking about also is not the girl who will go on to be his girlfriend later in the story. Even the character Matt in the Flesh, who was like a womanizing jerk, didn't talk about women like this. He talked about their appearances. He's like, "Oh, you have a nice petite figure. You shouldn't get fat." But like, he didn't talk about sex. He looked at his watch. The classroom was open for another half hour. They had 30 minutes to come up with something. "Would you get out of that chair?" Noel flung his foot out and kicked the side of Sam's seat. "You're squirming so much you remind me of my nephew when he needs to take a piss." "I can't get comfortable." My heart bleeds. There you go with the blood again. Noel grinned. It's all about the blood. This all about the blood thing will come up later. Language like piss will continue to be used. I point this out because when we get to the moral, I'm going to need to have a lot of evidence for the fact that this story is intended for older readers. Noel gets inspired by those creepy animatronics from Freddy Fazbear's Pizza to make the monster in their movie a creepy animatronic. The girl with a nice caboose, her name's Darla, and her friend Amber are the only ones left in the classroom, and they overhear Noel and Sam's plans. Amber teases them and calls them stupid, because their idea is stupid. And then they leave, and then Sam kicks Noel, and he's like, oh, Amber likes you. Again, Amber is not the caboose girl, it's the caboose girl's friend. While coming up with ideas for what animal their animatronic should be, Sam starts quoting the Raven. Millie would have loved him. Eat your heart out, whatever the boy's name in that story was. It was Dylan? Yeah, it was Dylan. They decide that a raven is too cliche, and so they want to go with a blackbird. The concept is that the blackbird makes its victims confess their sins and then punishes them if they're bad. So, like Kelsey and the new kid, it's an agent of justice, as long as that justice is killing people who've done anything wrong ever. Noel keeps bringing up blood and actually quotes the Merchant of Venice, saying, "If you prick us, do we not bleed?" The Merchant of Venice is an interesting story to bring up here because I think it's just a reference, but it is tangentially related to justice. So the Merchant of Venice is a Shakespeare play. A merchant named Antonio borrows money from a guy named Shylock. Shylock says he won't charge him interest, but if he can't pay back the debt, then he has to give him a pound of his own flesh. Antonio can't pay back the debt. This could be equivalent to like confessing your sins to Blackbird. Shylock hounds him for payment, like the Blackbird coming after you. And eventually Shylock demands that Antonio give him the pound of flesh. This goes to trial, and there's a whole part of the story that doesn't matter, but eventually Antonio's lawyer says that Shylock can have his pound of flesh because it's in the contract, but he can't take any blood. He also can't kill him. This is, of course, impossible, and so Shylock gives up. The court actually rules that this was like attempted murder, and so he actually has to give Antonio all of his money, and Antonio says, "I won't take the money. You can keep it, but you have to become a Christian instead of Jewish," and that's how the story ends. The "if you prick us, do we not bleed" line is actually foreshadowing. It happens earlier in the story when Shylock is talking about how Jews should be equal to Christians. Basically saying, we're human, we all bleed the same. This is to get the idea in the audience's head that being stabbed makes you bleed. So later when he's told he has to take flesh without making Antonio bleed, he realizes too that this is impossible. It makes the audience go like, oh my god, you're right, when you're pricked you do bleed, so he can't do it. So Noel quoting this at the beginning of Blackbird is a subtle reference to the fact that people bleed. I don't think that the whole Jewish-Christian thing is relevant to Blackbird, but the Merchant of Venice does talk about justice and paying debts and revenge and injustice and contract loopholes. So at the end of Blackbird, when Noel tries to atone for his sins to get the Blackbird to stop hounding him, we can look back on the Merchant of Venice to see how the stories differ or are the same. That's called juxtaposition. It's when you put two things next to each other and compare and contrast them. Noel and Sam go to a pizzeria because Frights fiction, and they decide that Sam is going to play the Blackbird because he's unnaturally tall, which leaves Noel to be the victim of the Blackbird in their movie. As they're eating, Amber walks up to them and talks to them about their project. She says her movie is going to have a lot of blood, and Noel is like, see, you gotta have blood. Amber, who only knows that their story is about birds, asks if they're ripping off The Birds, the Hitchcock movie about birds attacking people. Noel says that they aren't that derivative, which Amber mocks him for, saying that she doesn't think he knew big words like that. Sam thinks to himself, actually, they were being a little derivative, weren't they? They were piggybacking off of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The hair on the back of Sam's neck pricked. Why did that happen every time he thought of the place? The field! Sam lives at home with his parents. Again, he is a nerd. Again, he literally calls himself like a nerd. He had no use for partying. Working on his projects was more fun than drinking and acting like a moron. He never felt like he fit in with mainstream life. He's such a nerd that he doesn't even have a car. He walks the 2 miles to campus each day along some railroad tracks. Maybe they're the same railroad tracks from 1:35 a.m. and step closer. Sam, with his parents' help, makes a mascot bird costume. His dad starts to sing Bye Bye Blackbird, which is a Miles Davis song. We know that the reason the song was chosen is because the creature is a blackbird, and we know the blackbird was chosen not for any symbolic reason, but because Scott had a real nightmare about the blackbird. So the lyrics aren't really relevant. I did look at them, and I didn't come to any important conclusion about how they relate to the story, but maybe you can find some. Sam pricks his finger continually as he sews the feathers onto the bird costume. Is the agony of him poking himself built into the bird? He puts the suit on and is scared by how creepy it looks. He feels like he's not actually him anymore. This might be commentary on like being stuffed into an animatronic suit and not being yourself anymore. He had no doubt that poor Floyd, the character in the movie, would seriously regret his dark secret when he came face to face with the Blackbird. He thinks that now they just need to have a little blood to make Noel happy. He goes to school the next day and shows Noel a picture of the costume. Noel is legitimately frightened by it. They start to organize the set that they're using for the movie and casually segue into their deepest, darkest secrets. Noel asks Sam his, but Sam says that he doesn't have any. Noel doesn't believe this. Sam asks Noel for his deepest, darkest secrets, and Noel says that he regrets being a bully when he was 12. Sam asks him how he bullied people, and Noel says, okay, so there was this really awkward fat girl. She had all these weirdo habits, like she wouldn't look you in the eye, and she was always squeezing her hands together, and she had trouble talking. She didn't stutter, but she seemed to have trouble figuring out how to talk. She was just weird. She had funny facial expressions, and she wore the stupidest clothes I've ever seen. I mean, it looks like she did all her shopping at thrift stores, not the cool ones. Her clothes never matched and stuff. So I started calling her secondhand, SH for short, and when she'd walk down the hall, I'd go, shh. It caught on, and pretty soon, everyone was doing it. Noel laughed. That was a riot, stuff like that. Oh, and then one time she came to school wearing these high water pants. I mean, she looked so stupid, so my friends and I threw water in her face. Get it? High water. Noel laughed. And she wore these thick glasses and always looked like she was squinting to find her way. So I put a dead mole in her locker and asked her if she was grieving her best friend. Noel guffawed. Sometimes he just cracked himself up. He looked at Sam. Sam wasn't laughing. Sam pulled out the chair they'd placed in front of the desk in Floyd's room. You really think that stuff is funny? Sam asked. Well, yeah, Noel said. Don't you? You have to admit it's clever stuff, right? There was this time I got like a bucket full of burrs. That took a while to do, too. It's not easy gathering burrs. But see, the girl's name was Christine Wilbur. I remember her name because of the burr thing. And she had this long, stringy hair she never washed enough. So I figure I'd do burrs for Christine Wilbur. Get it? Burrs for Wilbur? It was actually an experiment. I wanted to see if burrs would stick to greasy hair. Of course, I had to have a control, so when I threw the burrs, I also threw them at her friend, Valerie. Valerie had frizzy hair that I was pretty sure she washed too much. And sure enough, the burrs stuck better on Valerie than they did on Christine. I'll never forget them standing there outside the school like a couple of monkeys picking lice off each other, trying to get those burrs out of their hair. Now that was funny. Noel laughed. Sam shook his head. That's not funny. Noel raised an eyebrow but didn't stop laughing. Seriously? Picture it. They're like two little monkeys. He pretended to be a monkey picking lice off another monkey. Sam frowned, stood up, and started pacing around the fake room. Then he abruptly stopped. Unless you're blind, you have to have noticed I'm not a normal-looking guy, right? When I was in junior high, I was already way too tall for my age, and my legs looked even longer than they do now because I was so skinny. I was bullied basically from the time I entered first grade until I got to my freshman year in high school. Then that year it stopped. But I can tell you that those jokes you think are so funny, they're not funny to the people on the receiving end of them. Sam crossed his arms and glared at Noel. Prior to this, Noel was continually told that he was an idiot, but then he kept proving that he wasn't. Noel also looked at women's butts. This is such a break in his character because the context for this conversation was him confessing that he used to be a bully. The idea of him guffawing over these memories is incongruous with the reason that he's even telling the story. It's also just way too juvenile for the Noel character that we've met this far. The language is literally dumbed down. I would not be surprised if these paragraphs were actually copy-pasted from Scott's outline, and then Andrea Wagner had to write an interesting story around it, got to this point, copy and pasted Scott's words, and then just continued with her version of Noel. The idea that this boy put a dead mole in her locker is just not something that fits with the rest of the story. It's too silly. Noel goes home to his frat house and passes by a roommate named Ian, who will be important later. He's like a next-door roommate, they don't share a bedroom. Ian is having trouble sleeping because it's a frat house and they party all night. Noel says that the noise doesn't bother him. Nothing keeps him awake. He can sleep through about anything. This is because sleeping soundly at night is another way of saying you don't feel guilty about something, so he's saying he does not feel guilty about bullying because he can just sleep soundly at night. It's also here to show that the sleep issues he's going to have soon are new to him. Ian says, I'm envious. I have trouble sleeping every night. Must have a guilty conscience, Noel says.
Say the line, Bart!
This analysis was very funny because you'd say something that made me go, oh, that's an interesting interpretation, and then immediately cut to the direct quote where the narrator just says that outright with zero subtext.
Yeah!
Noel goes to bed, he wakes up the next morning, he goes to their set to meet Sam to film their first big scene. Sam is supposed to bring the bird costume, Noel is trying to memorize his lines, but then Amber comes in. Amber tells Noel that Sam was hit by a train. Noel goes to the train tracks that Sam always walks down and finds it covered in police and Sam's parents. There's black feathers everywhere and there's no sign of Sam. So he either got clipped by the train and then ran off somewhere injured, or he exploded and popped like a blood balloon. Right now, they're just considering him missing, not dead, but very obviously he's hurt. Because of the way the feathers of his costume were scattered, they think he was probably grazed by the train and then thrown clear, but they haven't found him. Noel frowned and watched a black feather scuttle over the ground near the rails. That's when he noticed blood on the rail, on the opposite side of the tracks. Not a lot of blood, just one smear, but it was a big smear. A police officer was taking a picture of it. Blood, Noel thought. There had to be blood, he kept telling Sam. So at this point, there's 3 options. 1, Sam got hit by a train. 2, the agony bird, there's agony and the bird monster flew away or something. Noel is soon to be haunted by the Blackbird, so maybe the agony of the costume made him fly away from the train and he didn't get hurt. And then 3, it's a prank, bro. We never learned Sam's dark secret. Maybe he likes pulling pranks. Maybe his parents and the police are in on it. He's trying to convince Noel that you don't need a lot of blood to be scary, and now he's gonna scare him with the suit to teach him a lesson. My bet when I read this the first time was on number 3. We'll see what happens. Noel meets up with Amber a few times. They actually go on a date and they start dating. They're a couple now. But he's kind of losing his marbles a bit. He thinks to himself that he should have called Amber after their first date. And she goes, yeah, you should have. And he's like, what? Did I say that out loud? And she goes, yeah, you did say that out loud. Nolan starts to see the Blackbird behind every corner and through windows and just off in the distance. It's like Ballora from Dance With Me all over again. After a day of seeing the Blackbird, Noel goes to his room to sleep and we get a description of his room. It's full of pictures from black and white movies. Noel's frat brothers kept trying to get him to hang the frat's Greek letters in the room. Noel said he didn't need them to know what frat he was in. That refusal was just one of many that had earned him the nickname No. I don't think that was supposed to be as dark as it's implied to be. I would have edited that out at some point. It was unreasonable, but he was sure it was true. Noel was seeing Sam in the Blackbird costume, and Sam was stalking Noel. Why was Sam stalking Noel? It was obvious, wasn't it? Sam was stalking Noel because he was now the Blackbird, and the Blackbird tortured those who confessed their dirty secrets. So, first Sam was going to toy with Noel the same way a bully toyed with his victim, and then Sam was going to kill Noel for being such a horrible person. Noel was sure of it, and the worst part was that Noel deserved it. Noel is getting twitchy. The book says he decides not to watch a horror movie with his frat bros because he's too edgy. I think it means he's on edge. On edge means that, you're nervous and jumpy. Edgy means something totally different. Amber calls him. In case I haven't characterized her enough yet, she really likes to tease Noel and, punch him in the arm and, call him dummy, that kind of way. The best kind of girl. Noel is all jumpy. This is their conversation. Noel's phone rang and he snatched it up, hoping it was news about Sam. Sam's all right. He is, he thought before he said, hello? He is? It was Amber. Who is? You said he is? Amber said. He did it again? He really needed to stop saying his thoughts out loud. Wasn't I supposed to call you? Noel asked. You didn't. I know. Jerk. Noel's heart tried to strangle him. He swallowed to push it back into place. Maybe I had a reason, he said. I'm listening. My friend has turned into a big Blackbird and he's going to come and kill me, Noel thought. Then he gritted his teeth, waiting for Amber to tell him he'd said it out loud. Are you going for the obscene phone call technique? She asked. What? You're breathing heavily in my ear. It's not turning me on. Are you sure? Maybe there's a delayed reaction. Amber laughed. I'll let you know. Going from whatever these stories are about to heavy breathing turning a girl on, this story is really horny, guys. Noel tries to go to bed, but then we get the main thing that doesn't work in this story, that being him having nightmares or sleep paralysis moments about the bird. It's in the shadows. It's in his room. It's outside his room. He keeps hearing things. And this is the portion of the story that is just recreating Scott's sleep paralysis dream. And it's the same thing over and over and we know that it's a dream or an apparition, and so it's not scary. In 1:35 a.m., it's possible that the Ella doll was actually attacking Ella in real life, or it's possible that it was a dream. We weren't really sure. It was presented as real because Delilah thought it was real. She then ends up having a prolonged breakdown in public. She sees the Ella doll in real life. We're also primed for horror stories where you throw away something cursed and then it comes back to haunt you. In this, Noel just invents the character of the Blackbird, and then his own character starts to haunt him, and he's imagining it while trying to fall asleep because he's all like sad about his friend getting hurt and disappearing. Again, I think the story is constrained by Andrea Wagner having to write a story around Scott's concept, and that Scott's concept is stupid. I hate it. I hate that there's multiple instances of Noel trying to go to sleep and then he can't because the emo Big Bird is coming to get him. It's just not scary, in my opinion. Even though it has a lot of the same factors that made 1:35 a.m. scary, the difference is that in this narrative, it's a dream. It's very clearly a dream. So Noel is very spooked and he can't sleep, so he tries to think of non-scary things. While trying to think of good things, he thinks about the song his mom used to sing to him about good things, including rainbows and kittens. At first I thought this was the song A Few of My Favorite Things from The Sound of Music, but that song actually doesn't mention rainbows. It does mention whiskers on kittens, but there's no rainbow in there. So if that's the song she was singing, it's wrong. Or that's simply not the song that she was singing. So if you know a song about good rainbows and kittens, let me know. While trying to think about good things, he starts to think about Amber, because she's a good thing. Amber had freckles. Just a few of them. They crossed the bridge of her nose like bird tracks. Noel stiffened again. Now hold the phone. He is clearly saying that he's trying to relax by thinking of Amber because she's a good thing and going to sleep, and the idea of a bird got him so anxious that he freezes in place. But based on that word choice, I think the story needed another draft, Andrea Wagner. Ixnay on the Erds Bay, Noel told himself. He tried again. So Amber had these freckles, and she had a matching trail of them across the top of her chest. Then the window opens and something drops inside, and he turns on the light and he goes to check, but there's nothing there, and the window is latched, so it's like a ghost, or he was having a nightmare, or sleep paralysis or something. Also, the book is horny. He looked at his watch. It was only 11:25. Could he call Amber? And say what? Want to come over and listen for invisible intruders with me? There was a line he'd never tried before. So at this point in the story, we shouldn't be like surprised by this kind of thing, but even just the concept of Noel as a character who has used pickup lines to pick up women, like we have a FNAF character who has attempted to bring women back to his room to sleep with them by flattering them with pickup lines. How did we get here from Into the Pit? He tries to sleep, he hears something, he gets a baseball bat, he tries to sleep, he hears something, he tries to defend himself. The presence was sitting on Noel's bed, sitting on Noel. It was pressed down on him, engulfing him, insinuating itself into every part of him. Is he still thinking about Amber? And then, with a flash of light, he was free. He busted loose from his bizarre captivity and awoke so fully that when he opened his eyes, he was completely alert, and he had his bat in his hands. This was a good thing, because Noel was not alone in his room. A demonic presence of tenebrous feathers was poised right above his bed, so Noel swung his bat. In the nanosecond he swung, or was it the nanosecond before he swung, the thing above Noel's bed disappeared in an eruption of feathers that spewed throughout the room. Then the feathers vanished into nothingness. It happened so fast, Noel couldn't be sure it happened at all. All he could be sure of was that he did swing the bat. He knew this because his lamp hit the floor, and another bulb bit the dust. The time span in which Noel had seen the feathered thing was infinitesimal. It wasn't even a second. Noel's room went from sound and havoc to utter silence and stillness in the blink of an eye. And yet the image of what Noel had seen in that blink was burned onto his retinas, because he hadn't just seen feathers. He'd also seen soul-drilling, malevolent yellow eyes and a pointed, threatening beak. Those eyes had locked onto Noel's eyes. The sharp beak had aimed itself straight at Noel's guilty heart. Noel was sure it was the Blackbird, leaning over him with malicious intent. This wasn't just a still shot. This was a complete horror film playing out behind his eyeballs, in the theater of his own mind, without blood. Sam was right. You didn't need blood to have horror. The creep factor was horrific enough. Well, I'm glad we got told that directly and didn't have to think for ourselves. Noel decides to go outside and go for a run to feel better. A cop stops him because it's the early morning and he looks suspicious just running around. The cop asks him if he's drunk or high. That's right, marijuana is now FNAF canon. The cop believes him when he says that he's just having bad dreams. He goes and he flirts with Amber. She's seeing this, new side of him, because he usually doesn't go for jogs in the morning. And so she does, who are you, and what have you done with Noel? You must be a clone of Noel. The real Noel would never go jogging in the morning. She tells him the reason that he can't sleep is because of guilt. Duh. and tells him that he has to address the thing he's guilty about. He has to pluck it out at the root, like a weed, or like a feather from a bird. So now he's off to find Christine Wilbur. Actually, now we're off to waste a bunch of pages where he has another sleepless night and the bird attacks him. Ian, the frat brother from the next room, breaks down the door because he's screaming in his sleep. This is why Ian exists as a character. He exists to tell us that Noel is basically just dreaming the whole bird thing. Noel gets up, and now he goes out to find Christine. He knows that her father owns a diner, so he goes there to meet with the father to ask where Christine lives. He asks him where Christine lives, and he asks why Noel wants to know that. And he says he wants to apologize for being a bully. And the dad accepts this explanation, which is very similar to in Dance With Me, where people are just continually helpful and friendly and open to people who are trying to make amends for their past. And I think that's a good moral. He tells him what school Christine goes to, and so Noel heads off to find her college. He drives there, he goes inside, he finds her dorm room, he goes inside the dorm room, he finds her. Christine Wilbur wasn't overweight anymore. She was obviously as fit as Noel was. That wasn't the only way she was different. Although she still had the same facial features and quirky expressions, Christine held herself with an air of confidence that made it clear she was a very different girl from the one he'd known in junior high. Noel's mental processors were struggling to keep up with the unexpected information. His neural pathways were announcing, "This input does not compute." "Do you talk?" Christine asked. She hesitated and worked her mouth as if trying to find the right words. Then she said, "I'm not being mean or anything, it's just that you're standing there staring." She clasped her hands together and shrugged. Noel shook his head to try to reset his circuits. "You don't remember me?" he asked. "That's the first thing you say?" Christine laughed. He remembered that laugh. He'd only heard it once in junior high, when he'd watched her play with a ferret someone had brought to show and tell. Her laugh was a pleasant trill that made you want to laugh too. She set down her salad. "Okay, let's see." She stared at him, then shook her head. "No, I don't remember you. Should I?" "I would." "You would what?" "I'd remember me. If I were you, I mean." Noel pressed his hand to his forehead. Christine shrugged again. "Why don't you just tell me who you are?" Noel blew out air. "Okay." He opened his mouth, and he found he couldn't get the words out. His eyes filled with tears, and he had to swallow. Christine frowned. "Hey, are you okay?" Noel's eyes got even wetter. She was so nice. "I was the guy who bullied you in junior high." He said the words fast, sort of like peeling off a guilt bandage. "Which one?" Christine asked. Noel blinked. She shrugged and twitched her nose. "The Hate on Christine crew was pretty big. I started the shh thing, and I threw burrs on you." Noel felt like he was about an inch tall. He couldn't understand why he'd ever thought it was so funny, either when he did it or when he told Sam about it. "Oh, that was you?" She focused her small blue eyes on him. "I'm sorry, I've forgotten your name." "Noel Markham." She nodded. "I think I remember you. You didn't have all that hair then. You were skinnier too, no muscle." Noel blushed. He had been pretty slight in junior high. What had made him think he was so great he could make fun of someone else? He wiped his still wet eyes. Christine stood and skipped across the room toward him so quickly it was like she flew. Like a bird. She was extraordinarily elegant and precise in her movement. Noel stiffened, not sure what she was going to do. She hugged him. This wasn't at all how he thought this would go. At first, Noel just stood there, his arms rigid at his sides. But then the combination of her sincere kindness and the honey-sweet scent of her hair released him from his resistance. He hugged her back, blinking away his tears. Christine let him go and stepped away. She was so close he could see all her freckles and a few dark flecks in her blue eyes. "That wasn't an I forgive you hug," she said. "It was a thank you." "What?" Christine motioned for him to come into the room, and he did, sitting on her roommate's desk chair when Christine pulled it out. She returned to her desk, sat, and rotated her chair to face Noel. Clasping her hands together, she said, "I'm not going to tell you this to let you off the hook for bullying, but it looks like you really are sorry." "I really am," Noel said sincerely. He was surprised by how truly sorry he was. She nodded, thought for a few seconds, then said, haltingly, "I'm going to tell you this just because I learned something from it, and I figure maybe I can pass it on. In junior high, my mom was always on my case about everything. To be honest, I barely remember you, but I remember how bad I felt all the time. Eventually, though, I stopped feeling bad and I got angry. I decided to treat myself well. I liked to dance, and I started dancing to have fun. You know, just alone in my bedroom. But then I started going to a real studio, and I found out that I'm actually pretty good at it. When the music swept me up, nothing else mattered. Of course, my mom loved that dancing helped me lose weight, but that wasn't enough to make her happy. I think part of me will always struggle on some level with that." Noel stood, opened his mouth to protest. She came over and waved him off. "Don't, it's okay, see? That's the thing. All that bullying forced me to step up and love myself no matter what I see in the mirror, or what people say about me. I know my value. I'm actually here on a dance scholarship. So see, sometimes when something bad happens, it leads to something good." Noel nodded. Christine looked directly at him. And I do forgive you. You can let it go. I'm fine. Noel's eyes teared up again. He wiped them with the back of his hand. Christine looked over Noel's shoulder. She patted and squeezed his hand. Then he walked out into the hallway and she closed her door. Noel sagged against the wall. That's when he realized he no longer felt a presence lingering nearby. No more feathers. The hallway was silent. His headache was gone. Noel rolled his head from side to side and shrugged, then released his shoulders. His tension was gone too. It was all gone. He felt like he just set down a backpack full of bricks. So, I've seen people say that the moral of the story is that bullying is good sometimes, actually. I think that this is in conversation with, like, the boomer idea that we should bring back bullying to toughen kids up, and that making fun of people for being fat will help them lose weight, etc. And I do see that reading, like, that reading is in the text, but to come to that conclusion, you have to ignore the line where she says, I'm not going to tell you this to let you off the hook for bullying. I will talk about this more in the analysis section. We then get to the ending of the story. Noel gets to his car after talking to Christine and receives a phone call. They found Sam. He was clipped by the train, rolled down an embankment, broke his leg, and couldn't call out for help. It took them a long time to find him, but he's better now. Noel goes to him and apologizes for laughing about bullying, but Sam doesn't really care about that anymore because he's been dying in the woods for a few days. Noel still feels like apologizing. You're right, it's not funny. Sam waved the air with his crutch again. I was oversensitive about it. It's no big deal. No, Noel said. Being thoughtless is a big deal. Sam shook his head. I won't disagree with that, but I shouldn't have thrown stones at a glass house. Huh? I never answered you when you asked if I had secrets. Noel waited. Sam leaned in. Remember I said I was bullied? Noel nodded. Well, I got revenge on one of my bullies by bullying him right back. I played a really mean joke on him just before freshman year. Jerk. Sam laughed. Back at ya. Nah, Noel said. No more jerk clones. What? Noel laughed. Oh, it's a joke between Amber and me. Amber and me, huh? I want to hear about that. Want to grab a pizza? Sure, I'm starving. I haven't eaten since before noon. Why not? Long story. Maybe I'll tell you sometime. The Blackbird will make you tell, Sam said. Noel's heart stuttered, but then Sam laughed. This is why I had to tell you about the clone thing earlier, so that this made any lick of sense. Anyway, let's go to the analysis. Analysis. The back of the book says, sometimes the past can take on a life of its own. This is stupid and we will be ignoring it. The Blackbird is a manifestation of bad actions. The book tells us that. We get it. Moving on. First off, is the Blackbird real? Maybe. Sam says he got revenge on the people who bullied him in school, but doesn't elaborate. We know the bird wasn't literally Sam, but it could have been some sort of agony projection of him. The same way that, like, Kelsey was able to be an agony projection of Golden Freddy. So he's tormenting Noel until Noel makes an amend. It's kind of too coincidental that Sam was found directly after this happened. It seems like there's some sort of cosmic forces in play, but even if it's not, and this is just a dream that he was having, the moral of the story doesn't really change. And that moral is, being thoughtless is a big deal. And when you're thoughtless, you hurt people. And when you hurt people, it's your responsibility to make it up to them, to apologize, to change yourself, etc. And then it's their responsibility to forgive you. If someone wrongs you, forgive them. If you wrong someone, expect them to forgive you, and if they don't forgive you, forgive them for not forgiving you. Boom, I just solved every problem you will ever have. Going back to the discussion of the Merchant of Venice, in that story, Antonio is brought to court because he can't pay his debt. If we map that story onto Blackbird, we see that Noel going to apologize to Christine is like that court scene. She forgives him, obviously Shylock does not forgive Antonio. So it's sort of like a similar circumstance, but with different outcomes. Basically, there's not really much to say about the Merchant of Venice in Blackbird. It's just a reference that was brought up for a reference's sake. We still investigated it to see what would be said if you do juxtapose them. The answer is just not much. The moral of the story is not bullying is good, actually. Scott Cawthon, the guy who wrote this, and a dozen other Fazbear Frights stories about bullying, did not suddenly write a boomer bring back bullying story. The moral is not that bullying is good, the same way that Noel stiffening in bed is not about him getting an erection. It's a possible reading of the story, but it's obviously not the intended one. And I personally think that making little jokey jokes throughout the video about non-intended readings of the story is fine, but when you start talking about morals in this way, it becomes a problem. Suddenly you're putting words into the author's mouth that they never said. A great example of this is the movie Juno. The people who worked on that movie, which is about a teenage pregnancy where the teenager decides to carry the baby to term and then give it up for adoption, were asked if it was a pro-life or a pro-choice movie. The answer, they said, is that it's not a movie about abortion at all. It's a movie about this teenage girl. It's telling her story. Likewise, this is not a story about bullying, if it's always bad or if it's sometimes good. This is just a story about Noel. Christine got her life together and is a better person. That does not mean that victims of bullying get their life together and become better people. It's clearly not a message that bullying helps people. We know that's not the message because the entire story is about Noel being hunted by a giant bird monster for bullying people. This is the franchise that started with... I see this crop up everywhere, and it's actually my least favorite aspect of critical analysis, and that is the concept of death of the author. Death of the author, in short, states that there are so many works where we don't know what the author actually meant, so that instead of arguing to discover what they meant, we should instead look at what the text says on its own. For ancient stories where, like, the author is actually dead, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, this is fine, but I think applying this to modern literature is one of the worst things you can possibly do, and I hate it. It is not an equally valid reading of the story to say that it's pro-bullying, just because you can technically argue it with quotes from the book. Death of the author is a cancer on literature, and that is one of the strongest opinions that I have. The next thing that people will sometimes say is that while it's not the author's intention, it is still a possible reading. And because some people might get that moral from the book, it's written poorly and is also possibly dangerous. And I think that opinion is equally as stupid. Books cannot be dangerous. Period. If someone gets the wrong moral from a book or a dangerous idea from the book, that's on the reader, not on the book. Possibly it's on the society that produces someone who's poor at reading, but that's a different thing. We do label books by age or grade for what they're appropriate for, like these books are supposed to be appropriate for 12-year-olds, that's what it says, but grade and age don't always equal intelligence. It's not like you turn 18 and you're suddenly smart enough to read and deal with the morals and lessons of every book ever written. You still need to develop the skills to read those books. People often point to TV shows like Breaking Bad or BoJack Horseman or It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, which have horrible main characters, and they point to fans of those series who actually idolize the main characters and think that they're cool instead of being bad guys. Those people will then say that those shows are harmful. And no, they aren't. One of the best quotes about censorship comes from Mark Twain. He said, "Censorship is telling a man he can't have a steak just because a baby can't chew it." I don't think anyone was ever arguing that the shows should be taken off the air, but by saying that they're written poorly because they allow some members of the audience to take away the wrong moral, what they're saying is that they shouldn't have come out the way that they did, and that future shows should be written to avoid these pitfalls, which is still censorship. It's the same concept. This art shouldn't exist in this form because some people aren't mature enough to consume it and it might harm them. And I have absolutely zero tolerance for telling an artist what they should or shouldn't do. At least in a legal sense. Obviously telling an author that like they wrote something silly is different. I've been saying it for this whole book, but this book is clearly for an older audience than the previous Fazbear Fright stories. The age rating might still be 12, but by looking at the text, it's clearer that it's written for an older audience than Into the Pit. And so its moral being more complex than Into the Pit and requiring a higher level of criticism and literary analysis to understand is fine. A lot of series grow up with their readers. The Harry Potter books get darker and more complex as they go, as the characters age from 11 to 17. And so too does the complexity of the books. The Avatar: The Last Airbender series, while in my opinion actually gets less complex as it goes, did deal with more complex themes as the series went on. The final season of The Legend of Korra came out in 2015. The creators consciously made Korra, in this final season, age 21, so that kids who were the same age as Aang when the series premiered in 2005, and were 11 years old, would now be 21, the age of Korra, as the series ends in 2015. Star Wars: The Clone Wars got more mature as the series went on. This maturity level then reset when the sequel series Rebels came out. This kind of thing is very common in children's media. So Blackbird, being book 6 out of 12, being more complex and mature than the stories that came before it, makes perfect sense and lines up with the way that children's media is usually produced. This is understandable and actually expected. I think the step from the previous story, The Man in Room 1280, to Blackbird is a very large step. It's a symbolic leap towards more mature stories. We've talked about Coming Home, which is sad. We've talked about Step Closer, which is graphic and violent. And we've talked about The Man in Room 1280, which is a fairly boring story about the nature of evil. But I think starting now with Blackbird, we're seeing stories with more complex worldviews. It's not just dark and sad, it actually takes a lot of thinking to understand what it's talking about. This will also be true with the next story, The Real Jake. It's a much more difficult story to grapple with, even if it's not as gruesome and bloody as previous stories. This story has nothing to do with Frights fiction, because there's no Freddy stuff in it. Thank you for watching. Be sure to be nice to each other in the comments, consider supporting the creators you admire, never lose sight of the things that are important to you, and remember that Freddy stands for Friendly, Respectful Engagement, Discussion, and Discourse Yields Success. I would like to thank my March patrons: Brandon, Lady Lilac, Lauren V, Morgan, Nan, Scott, and Sophie. along with Billy, Klaus, Eliza, Halmar, Johnny the Night Guard, Kira, Lauren R., Rhiannon, Rose, Sebhar, Thamagata, World's Greatest Bard, Ya Boy Peachy, and Zany Face, along with Emily, Jinx, Jose, Just That Spark, Rolo, Riley, Shadowmaster, and Tanner McCoolman, as well as Jeannie and Ray. We will see you next time.
Yeah, 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 whenever you wait. Now snart vill någon in. Baff,